Okay, so today I'm not going to be talking to you about my PhD work. In fact, this is a brand new talk for me, but it's something I've been thinking about for a really, really long time in my clinical career. And as Paul mentioned, I was very privileged to have the PhD training of my colleagues here at Aspetar, so that I can now incorporate some of the research evidence to clinical practice, and that's what I hope to gain from today's lecture. So we all remember this sort of tragic incident of Usain Bolt in his final competitive race at a major championship. And, you know, these are really dramatic videos, and it's what we remember, particularly at major championships. But in fact, the vast majority of track and field injuries that we deal with are overuse injuries, and you won't see such dramatic effects of these overuse injuries. But injuries and illness affect performance across a multitude of sports, in fact, across all sports. We know this from the UEFA football data, and in fact, it's also been shown here with the Qatar Stars League data by our own Cristiano Reali. But it's also been shown in track and field, and I believe Ben Ray Smith is in the audience. Ben, can you stand up, please? You're here? Who didn't make it? What a shame. Okay. So Ben and Mick Drew performed this study where they looked at number of training weeks completed and how it related to personal performance goals at major championships. And you can see quite clearly from this data that if an athlete is able to complete more than 80% of their planned training weeks, they have a much higher chance of success in terms of achieving their personal training goals, performance goals. And the actual rate of likelihood of success in achieving your performance goals is 7 times if you're able to complete 80% of planned training weeks. So that's fairly compelling evidence. So it's clear that we need to focus on our risk reduction strategies to minimise injury and illness burden, and also because we have a duty of care to the athlete. But there's growing evidence that maximising training time will maximise performance and give you a better chance of winning that gold medal. So how do we go about implementing our risk reduction strategies? Well, first of all, we need to think about the model and what type of measure we want to implement. Is it a primary prevention model? Is it a secondary prevention measure? Or is it a tertiary prevention measure? And today's talk, I'm going to be focusing on secondary prevention measures. In terms of the primary prevention measures, we're aiming to address the causal or the risk factors and implementing this in healthy athletes, so your whole squad of athletes. And the type of primary prevention measure that what you might be familiar with are things like group exercise programs, but also screening of healthy athletes for their strength, range of motion, perhaps movement quality, and implementing individualised exercise programs is something that many of us as clinicians have been familiar with for a long, long time. We have really good evidence that group prevention programs are effective at reducing injury risk. In fact, we have so much evidence in preventing ACL injury that we can now do meta-analyses of the meta-analyses and clearly demonstrate a 50% reduction in ACL injuries if you implement some form of specific training program. But we also have systematic review evidence in several other areas. We have use of neuromuscular training for reducing ankle injuries, use of bracing to reduce ankle injuries, and our own Nicole van Dijk has done a fantastic systematic review showing that you can halve hamstring rates if you implement the Nordic hamstring exercise. So we have good evidence for group exercise programs in terms of primary prevention for common injuries. But there's questionable value of the use of screening for primary prevention. I know Roald's going to he's going to discuss in his presentation a lot more on this, and so will Nicole van Dijk tomorrow. So the NHS is really looking at whether they're wasting a lot of money on their primary screening programs and are we really actually getting value from a lot of these screening programs? And everyone is familiar with this headline, but also this headline. So we really need to start thinking differently about the benefits of screening. And this is where I feel we can use screening in a more effective way for secondary prevention. And in fact, we also have evidence of this. Screening is effective at identifying athletes with current symptoms. And so therefore, it can be really helpful to use screening for secondary prevention as the early detection of existing conditions. And then if we follow up with an appropriate intervention, we are likely to minimise the impact of that condition and also reduce the risk of future injury. And this is really the premise of secondary prevention and using monitoring or screening for secondary prevention. So we're also familiar with this sports injury causation model, which was introduced a long time ago now. And we have our susceptible athlete, and if they experience an inciting event, they have a chance of being injured. But if we conduct monitoring and secondary prevention strategies, we can detect them at that point prior to the inciting event. And if we apply an appropriate intervention, they should be able to manage that inciting event without getting injured. And this is the idea of secondary prevention. And we now have a current model of sports injury risk profiles. And this is the complex systems approach, which was presented by Natalia Bittencourt. And the idea of this complex systems approach to sports injury causation is that we have this web of risk factors and moderators and mediators that all interact with each other. And some of these risk factors are more important and some of these factors are less important. And we have different risk factors for different injuries. We need to understand and have knowledge of the risk factors for these injuries in order to implement prevention strategies. Because a considerable number of these risk factors are actually modifiable. And so we have potential to alleviate the risk by implementing appropriate prevention programs. The interesting thing about this approach is that our injuries can actually have a different risk profile depending on the sport. So on the previous slide, I showed you some of the risk factors for ACL injury in basketball, and this is some of the risk factors for ACL injury in ballet. So a different athlete has a different set of risk factors, and clearly in a lot of sports and with a lot of injuries, we need a lot more research to understand the risk factors for that injury in that sport. So we have a lot of questions about monitoring and secondary prevention. We need to know what to monitor, what are our main injuries, and what are our optimal outcome measures for monitoring those injuries. We need to know how to monitor. What standardised tests are we going to use? Do we have appropriate PROMs that may be effective at picking up some of the early signs of these conditions? And we need to know when to monitor, how often. Do we want to monitor every day? Do we want to monitor every week or every month, or is once a year enough? And thinking about this categorisation of risk factors really helps to answer these questions. So we have universal risk factor categorisation, selective and indicative. And I'll go through these individually. So for universal measures, these are the type of monitoring measures that we're going to implement with our whole squad of athletes. The types of universal monitoring measures are aiming to identify or address risk factors that are common to all athletes. We're going to monitor the sleep of all our athletes. We need to ensure they're getting enough sleep and good quality sleep. We're also going to monitor their diet and make sure that their nutritional status is optimal. And that's going to be common across all athletes, whether they do high jump, whether they're a football player, whether they're a swimmer. We're probably also going to monitor some sort of muscle soreness, particularly in sports that have a lot of overuse injuries like track and field. Now, where you monitor the muscle soreness may differ depending on the sport. So in a water polo player, you're going to monitor shoulder pain and muscle soreness around the shoulder. In a volleyballer, you're going to look more at soreness around the knee. And I'm going to argue that training load monitoring is really a universal measure that we need to do across all our athletes. Now, again, I want to acknowledge Ben Ray-Smith, who's the lead physiotherapist for the Australian track and field team, and he is conducting really, really detailed monitoring. And I'll just take you through this graph a little bit. So the orange bars represent daily load, and the load metric that's used for their athletes will depend on what event they do. So in this particular athlete, it's a marathon runner. So the load metric that they use is number of kilometres run multiplied by RPE. Now, if that's a long jumper, they might look at something like number of jumps done multiplied by RPE. So the metric is different depending on the event. So we have daily load, and then we have weekly load represented by the blue bars. We have the acute on chronic workload ratio. And if you can see the dots, the smaller dot is the planned load, and the larger dot is the actual load. So we have this zone of low risk, and what you want is both the planned load and the actual load to be, first of all, close together, because you want the athlete to do what was planned, and you want both of those dots to ideally be within that zone of risk. And when the athlete is consistently doing under what was planned and they're outside that zone of risk, then that's a flag that they need to be followed up. So this is the kind of detailed load monitoring that's occurring in Australia. And I know that Marco is going to be speaking much more about training loads, so that's pretty much all I'm going to say about training load. So in terms of selective measures, so now we've gone past things we're doing for our whole squad and going more into our selective measures. So these are the type of monitoring of measures that we would do to our small squad within our big squad. So this might be just our group of marathon runners, or it could be our group of high jumpers or our hurdlers within a sprint squad. So this small group, because of what they do, their particular event, are going to have a different risk profile. So we know that we have programs that are beneficial for that particular group. So if you look at something like the knuck control or the knee control exercise, that has been specifically designed for female adolescent football players. And we know it's effective in that group. So if we have, say, a group of hurdlers, we know that hurdlers are higher likelihood of having groin pain. We know that using the Copenhagen adduction exercises reduces the chance of groin pain in football players. We should give that to our hurdlers. But really not much point giving that to our swimmers, because they don't have a very high incidence of groin pain. So that's a kind of selective intervention, as you can see my next point. So what we have to have an understanding of is what the epidemiology is within the athletes that you're managing. So if we think about athletics as an umbrella term, we have race walking, we have road running, both cross-country and marathon. We have track running, which involves sprints, hurdles and middle distance. We have jumps, lots of different types of jumping. We have throws, lots of different types of throwing events. And then we have those crazy people that do everything, the combined events. So each one of these squads are actually going to have a different risk profile and a different injury profile that you will need to address in your prevention program. So it starts getting really, really complicated. So we need to perhaps narrow it down to an injury profile for that event and apply our risk reduction strategies based on that injury profile, and also consider whether you're trying to prevent acute injuries versus overuse injury. Right, so how do we do this in the practical aspect? So we have our hurdler, and I know she's female, and females are less likely to have groin pain, but is also Australia's best ever hurdler, so I had to show a picture of her. So if we think about a hurdler that has a higher chance of obtaining groin pain, we know that there is a considerable number of risk factors that are non-modifiable. And you could question whether competition schedule is non-modifiable, but if you're talking about something like a World Championships or an Olympics, That's clearly a non-modifiable risk factor. Previous injury, age and sex are other factors that have been identified. But there's also considerable modifiable risk factors. And these are the kind of risk factors that we can keep an eye on with our monitoring and address with an appropriate intervention. How are we going to monitor for groin pain? We have very good tools that have been validated, like the Hagos, the Copenhagen adductor squeeze, and measuring eccentric strength. So something like the adductor squeeze, you may want to conduct you may want to conduct the Hagos every month. So it depends on the measure and the susceptibility of that athlete to that injury, how often you conduct your monitoring. Things like eccentric strength, you wouldn't want to be doing more than perhaps once every week or every couple of weeks. Now, interestingly, it's really, really difficult to attain good evidence of the efficacy of these kind of prevention measures. However, Tanya Pizzari's PhD student has published some emerging evidence that monitoring for secondary prevention can be effective at reducing incidence of groin pain. So Martin used an alert system when his football players had adductor strength that was outside the normal range, Hagos scores that started to drop outside the normal range. He implemented a multimodal management plan and demonstrated an ability to reduce the injury burden from groin pain. How often do we monitor? Well, daily we might need to monitor things like sleep quality, soreness, pain, etc. Weekly would be looking more like pain provocation tests, perhaps strength or range, depending on the injury, depending on the athlete. Our longer questionnaires, we probably do not want to conduct them more than monthly unless it's a very, very short questionnaire. And some of our monitoring will only need to be done annually, like cardiac screening or vitamin D status. We can also use these principles for injuries other than groin pain. I know that's the area that I'm most familiar with, but if you have a javelin thrower, maybe it's not relevant. So if you look at something like shoulder pain, again, we have some non-modifiable risk factors, and we have a lot of excellent evidence lately looking at some of the identified risk factors for shoulder pain in throwers, and we know that reduced external rotation strength and scapular dyskinesis are risk factors that can basically increase the risk at a common training load in handball players, likely to be the same with javelin throwers. So we want to monitor for shoulder pain in a lot of our overhead athletes, and we can use something like the Oslo overuse questionnaire, simple questionnaire conducted weekly in some studies and conducted monthly in others, but a really good clinical tool to keep an eye on the shoulder soreness in your squad. Things like pain on the Hawkinson-Kennedy test, looking at range of motion, particularly internal rotation range of motion, and external rotation strength. So these are the sort of things that you may keep a close eye on and monitor for any significant changes, and marry that up with their training load and their reports of any sort of pain. But now we delve down into the individual. So we have measures that we're going to give to our whole squad, measures that we're going to give to our smaller squad within the bigger squad, and now we need to look at specific things we might give to specific individuals. So one particular individual within a larger squad. Now, why would we look at a particularly vulnerable individual? Well, it may be that this particular individual has a past history of an injury that is really prevalent in their event. They could be particularly vulnerable to some sort of external load changes. We all know the athlete that does really, really well, but as soon as it comes into competition season, they start to break down. The risk profile could be different for every individual, so we need to really identify the trigger or the risk factor that is relevant for that particular athlete, and also the intervention that is effective for that particular athlete. So we think about something like a shoulder injury in a javelin thrower. There may be an athlete that every time the internal rotation range becomes under, say, 40 degrees, they develop shoulder pain. And we know that from having worked with this athlete for a long time. So we're going to monitor their internal rotation range really carefully, particularly as we're coming into finals. And perhaps with that athlete, they love dry needling. So we're going to implement dry needling to restore their internal rotation range. Another athlete, it might be stretches are effective. So we have to identify what is the trigger for that athlete and then the intervention that is good for them. We're going to monitor their internal load or their response to their training and competition load using the various monitoring tools that I've described. But it really, really relies on establishing strong and long-standing working relationships and optimal communication between the athlete and yourself, between the team, including the coach, and the performance team. So we know that people like distance runners are particularly vulnerable to Achilles tendon pain. But the risk factors for that distance athlete may be different from his comrade. It may be that one of the distance runners is particularly vulnerable when they start doing hill training. Another one may be every time they have a long haul flight and they start to run afterwards, they have Achilles pain. Another athlete may be particularly vulnerable when their calf starts getting tight, and another one may be whenever they do exams, their Achilles starts getting sore. So we need to identify what's the risk factor for that particular athlete and really closely monitor that athlete for that risk factor. You may use something like the Visa A, hot pain, pain on palpation, and in the long term you look at calf endurance and dorsiflexion range. So these are the kind of things that we can monitor and keep an eye on, as well as some of the other measures that we discussed. As I mentioned before, having optimal communication is absolutely essential for the efficacy of secondary prevention measures and monitoring. We need to have a good communication between the coach and the athlete, but also between the athlete and the sports medicine provider and the whole performance team. And without that close communication and that trust, these kind of measures, you're just monitoring and monitoring and monitoring without having any efficacy of the monitoring. Because in the end, we really want our athletes to reach the edge of that cliff, and we want them to push themselves as far as their bodies can go, but we don't want them to fall off the cliff. So that's what we're trying to do with this type of monitoring. So where's the future with this? Well, we know we have a big problem with track and field because we only have small numbers of elite athletes in each country. So I really would like to have a call to the researchers involved in track and field to look at individual patient data. So imagine if we had all these squads all over the world and we had all this great data from our standardised monitoring, and we have outcome data of performance and injuries. What a brilliant data set we can have. And all of these web determinants can be plugged into a computer, and we can then spew out some machine learning to tell everyone around the world these are the best ways to monitor for this particular injury to maximise the performance in this particular athlete. I know it's a dream, but I think we can do it. So for me, monitoring and secondary prevention really is the future of screening. We need to look at our universal monitoring for the whole squad. We need to understand the epidemiology, know the main injuries for each event and the risk profiles for those injuries. And in some injuries and some events, we need a lot more research to really have better understanding of those risk profiles. Then we do selective monitoring to the squad that is particularly vulnerable to that injury. And then we need to know our individual athlete, and we do indicative monitoring that's specific for that athlete. But at the end, communication is absolutely essential to the success of this, and we have to implement something with early and appropriate intervention. There is no point in having this data analysis paralysis. We actually have to do something to prevent the injuries. And I'd just like to acknowledge my new team of researchers at La Trobe University, the FORCE team and also the WISE team, but I don't have a slide for them. Thank you.